Francis Fukuyama, Political Order and Political Decay, chapters 29 through 31, lecture 2. In this lecture, we get to chapter 31, which is entitled Political Decay. And this chapter is the beginning of the last part of the book, which is about the phenomenon of political decay. Now, in some ways, this is a topic that we have seen show up already in numerous places over the course of his two books. We've seen examples of political decay come up in the Chinese Empire. We've seen political decay. One of the first, I think, sustained discussions of political decay in this two-volume work of Fukuyama's was his discussion of the Muslim Middle East and North Africa and the way in which the system of military slavery decayed over time. So we've seen it there also. With this part of the book, of this second volume, he really focuses on the United States almost entirely for his discussion of political decay, because as probably you've noticed when you do the readings, he thinks that there has been serious political decay in the United States. So chapters 31, 32, 33, and 34 are focused primarily on the United States. He begins chapter 31 by talking about the Forest Service. As you might recall, earlier in the book, the Forest Service had been an example of successful state building in the U.S. in terms of building governmental capacity. But the Forest Service, which was once a model of competent autonomy in the government, is no longer the case. It is now subject to irreconcilable mandates, that there are multiple things that government and the people want from the Forest Service that are not really compatible with one another. So on the one hand, we want sustainable exploitation of natural resources, but on the other hand, we also want fire protection, and then on the other hand, we also want conservation, right? So you have these kind of conflicting mandates, so that it's pretty much literally impossible for the Forest Service to do everything that is expected of it to do, not simply because there's lots for it to do, but because contradictory things are demanded of it. And of course, out of these kind of irreconcilable multiple mandates, you end up with a very inefficient agency, in the sense that it's got to kind of spend money everywhere. And it's also, as with most bureaucratic agencies, that there's also a great deal of self-protection involved in the Forest Service, that it doesn't want its budget cut and so on and so forth. So it tries to maintain its budget, it tries to maintain its place, and it tries to keep all these various groups happy by spending here and spending there and doing a bunch of different things. And, at the end of it, it's much messier and much less autonomous than it used to be. But that's just one example of in fact, many agencies that have met a similar fate. And one of the other things he mentions about the feature of political decay, and he's getting this from, I think, predominantly from the scholarship of John DiIulio, who wrote a book, I can't remember what it's called, I think it's called Leviathan by Proxy. But one of the things that he points out is that the government does lots of things today, a lot more things in the U.S. than it did 100 years ago. And it also mandates that a lot more things be done. So there are some things that the federal government doesn't actually do directly, but requires the state governments to do. So it does more. The federal government does more directly. It mandates that the states do more. But the funny thing about it is that the government's not actually bigger. Normally you would expect that if the government does more, that the size of the government would grow too, in terms of the number of employees and the number of agencies. But actually it's not the case. And I think it was John DiIulio put it, we outsource Leviathan. We do lots and lots of stuff, but a lot more of it is through contracts with private contractors. Think about the way that at the University of Dallas, the food services are not done directly by UD, but through a contract with Aramark, right? So they've kind of outsourced the provision of food and the running of the cafeteria to another company. So, and then in that sense, they're not part of the university's employee base, but in effect they do the university's work. So the government, there are a lot of agencies that are inefficient, that have multiple and irreconcilable mandates. There are more mandates out there, more requirements from government, but oftentimes things are inefficient, and at times they're also outsourced. Now, as Fukuyama says, like, look, we need institutions. Institutions, you can't have society without institutions. Institutions provide the rules that we can follow so that we can live and act together collectively in a stable way, and we invest them with value, right? But of course, that can also mean that our alliance or our allegiance to institutions is not always necessarily rational. We develop kind of an emotional tie to particular institutions that at times can be harmful, actually. But even though we need institutions, it's obvious we need institutions. You do not have human societies without various institutions, but institutions very much can decay. And his basic definition for decay here is just failure to adapt, that things change and institutions are not able to keep up with those changes. And as he says, institutions decay when they are no longer adapted to their circumstances, which can happen for various reasons. So it's decay, by which he means failure to adapt to circumstances. It can be a product, he kind of names two big things. It can be a product of what he calls cognitive rigidity, or it can be a product of insider capture, or what he calls repatrimonialization. And we'll see both of these things at work in the United States. Now, cognitive rigidity is when you stick to a certain way of thinking about and doing things, despite good evidence that it's not working anymore. And he gives the example with the Forest Service of scientific fire prevention, that the notion that there's a scientific method for preventing fires actually ended up making forest fires much more destructive when they happened. But there was just a certain way of thinking about this is, year in, year out, this is the way we prevent forest fires. And people, being kind of creatures of habit in their thoughts as well, they just kind of do things a certain way. I mean, some people would argue, think we've got this crazy sort of real-time experiment with higher education going on right now, where instead of being in the classroom, we're all doing things remotely, and it's very disruptive. And some people who are very pro kind of educational reform of a certain kind are saying, look, we need to break out of the cognitive rigidity that tells you that the way to get a higher education is by spending 4 years at a residential institution where you sit in a class and you listen to a person talk, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So some people would say the very university system itself, the way that education is provided, K through 12 and then college, that way of doing things, that there's evidence that it doesn't really work very well, but that's the way we do it. And so we keep on doing it. You have this kind of institutional inertia. This is the way you think about things. He gives other examples just of policies, like always favoring tax cuts, even though there might be circumstances where a tax increase might be a better approach. So one way that institutions can decay is if thinking fails to adapt, and that's cognitive rigidity. But then the other one, which he talks about beginning on page 463, is insider capture or repatrimonialization. And this is the thing you find all over the place in the US and in lots of other countries. And this is where you have the agencies themselves are really, to a certain extent, being run by and for certain particular interests within society rather than broadly for the public good in an autonomous and impersonal way. And again, we've seen repatrimonialization already in previous readings we've done with the Mamluks and the Janissaries, with the Ancien regime in France, this way that public offices get kind of converted to private benefit streams, and the way that can lead institutions to become rigid and ill-adapted over time, in that case, because people aren't really invested in making them better. Now, he mentions in this chapter, Federalist 10, he sort of raises this question, why, since Republican government is based on the principle of majority rule, insider capture very much suggests a small group of people basically using the government to benefit their own particular private interests. You might say, why doesn't the Republican form of government save us from this problem? Why do we have problems of insider capture when it's very clearly the case that any small group of insiders would obviously be outvoted by the majority that does not have an interest in maintaining the privileges or the particular benefits of small minorities? So how can we have all of this insider capture in a system characterized by majority rule? It doesn't make sense. Well, insiders have advantages that they can use to protect themselves, right? Ordinary voters might be ignorant of policy matters that, insiders, where they know things and they can act on them. They can keep up with what's going on. Some groups may fail to see their true interests and fail to act on them. Just because a policy is harmful to a group of people doesn't mean that that group of people being harmed can really develop a sense of collective identity that would motivate them to act on it. They could just remain dispersed individuals. Also, some groups are better able to organize and press or protect their interests than are others. Farmers are more mobilized than consumers. So you have a lot of farm subsidies. The middle class is more politically mobilized than the poor, so a lot of public policy is more answerable to middle class concerns rather than the concerns of the poor. And also, winners in the market, the wealthy, can translate their economic resources into political access because they have money, and through money they can have an influence on the system that those without money do not have. So even with a system of majority rule, within the way the government actually works, there are multiple opportunities for insiders to take advantage of the process in order to push their particular interests, and to do so in a way that cannot be effectively opposed by the broader mass of society, because the broader mass of society might just be incapable of actually organizing and acting on the basis of some of its interests. Now, but as he notes, even when you have this kind of political decay, that's not necessarily the same thing as civilizational decay. And this is what he talks about at the very end of the chapter on page 466. He says, the decay of American political institutions is not the same thing as the phenomenon of societal or civilization decline, which has become a highly politicized topic in the discourse about America. America's greatest strengths have never been the quality of its government. The private sector has, from the start, always been more innovative and vital. Even as government quality deteriorates, new opportunities open up in sectors like shale gas or biotechnology that lay the basis for future economic growth. Political decay in this instance simply means that many specific American political institutions have become dysfunctional, and that a combination of intellectual rigidity and the power of entrenched political actors growing over time is preventing the country from reforming them. End of quotation. So that's the kind of the overview of the problem of decay. And what we'll get to in the next series of lectures are the particular forms in which you find political decay within the political system of the United States of America.